She swore an oath over her brother's grave, to find his killer and make him pay. For 3 years she tracked the man they called the Black Wolf through the desert, her heart burning with vengeance. But when she finally found him, bleeding, unbroken beneath the merciless sun, everything she believed shattered like glass. Sometimes the line between justice and mercy isn't written in blood. It's written in the choices we make when our worst enemy becomes human. If you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Trust me, this journey will change how you see redemption forever. Clara's fingers traced the worn silver locket against her throat, feeling the familiar weight of her brother's photograph inside, a talisman of grief worn smooth by 3 years of constant touch. The morning mist clung to the valley like unspoken grief, tendrils of white vapor weaving through the mesquite and juniper, transforming the landscape into something ethereal and haunting. She stood at the edge of the red sandstone cliff, her bare feet gripping the warm stone, watching shadows dance across the rugged terrain below like memories that refuse to fade. Somewhere in those rolling hills, among the hidden canyons and forgotten arroyos, lived the man they called Lobo Negro, the Black Wolf. The name itself was a curse whispered in cantinas and spoken in hushed tones around evening fires. With him lived the promise she had carried for 3 years, like a stone lodged in her chest, growing heavier with each passing season, each sleepless night, each moment when Miguel's laughter echoed in her dreams, only to dissolve into waking silence. The wind pulled at her dark hair, long and unbound, whispering secrets she wasn't ready to hear. Truths about vengeance and healing, about the difference between justice and revenge. Her grandmother's voice echoed across the years, speaking, words in a mixture of Spanish and English that had shaped Clara's childhood. Revenge is a river that drowns the one who drinks from it, mija. But forgiveness is the rain that makes the desert bloom. The old woman was gone now, her weathered hands stilled, her wisdom carried to a place where Clara could no longer reach for comfort in the darkest hours before dawn. She pressed the locket harder against her skin, feeling the sharp edges of her vow cutting into her palm. The metal had warmed against her body, and inside, Miguel's young face smiled eternally. 19 years old, eyes bright with dreams of teaching children, of changing the world with books and kindness and the patient work of hope. That face had been her compass through 3 years of searching, through nights spent tracking rumors across the borderlands, through moments when she'd almost lost herself to the darkness that lived in the spaces between heartbeats. Today, she would begin the descent into the valley. Today, she would find him. The sun was already painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, and Clara knew that every moment of delay was another moment Miguel's killer drew breath in a world that no longer held her brother's laughter. She gathered her few possessions, a key, water gourd, jerky wrapped in oiled cloth, the knife her father had given her on her 15th birthday, and turned her back on the cliff that had been her vigil point for 2 months. The path down was treacherous, carved by flash floods and worn by the passage of deer and coyotes. Each step took her further from the person she had been before Miguel's death, further into a country where she would either find peace or lose herself entirely. But she had stopped caring about the distinction. The only thing that mattered was keeping the promise she had made over his grave, when the earth was still fresh and dark above his coffin, and her tears had fallen like rain on the desert soil. The cantina squatted like a brown adobe toad at the crossroads, its walls scarred by bullet holes and time, its windows clouded with dust and the accumulated breath of desperate men. Clara sat in the corner, where the shadows gathered thickest. Her rebozo pulled low over her face, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The liquid was bitter as regret, but she drank it anyway, letting the familiar taste ground her in the present moment, while her ears strained to catch fragments of conversation that floated like smoke through the dim, alcohol-heavy air. Men spoke in hushed tones about recent sightings, a figure moving through the southern canyons like a ghost, always alone, always just beyond the reach of the law. The descriptions varied depending on who was telling the story. Sometimes he was 8 feet tall with eyes like burning coals. Sometimes he was ordinary looking, the kind of man who could disappear into a crowd. But they all agreed on one thing. He was wounded, had been for weeks, maybe months. "Saw blood on the rocks near Agua Dulce," muttered a grizzled prospector, his voice rough from years of breathing desert dust. "Fresh blood, too. Whatever got him good." "He's wounded," confirmed the bartender, polishing a glass with practiced indifference, his movements automatic after decades of the same ritual. The glass caught the lamplight, throwing fractured rainbows across the scarred wooden bar. "Been seen limping near the old mission ruins. Father Martinez said he found boot prints in the mud by the well, prints with blood in them." Clara's heart quickened, a hummingbird's rapid flutter against her ribs, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, the mask she had perfected over months of hunting. 3 years of searching had taught her patience, had carved hollows beneath her eyes and etched lines around her mouth that aged her beyond her 25 years. She had learned to move like smoke, to listen like shadow, to ask questions without seeming to ask them. The borderlands were full of people who asked too many questions, and most of them ended up in unmarked graves. She finished her coffee, the dregs gritty against her tongue, and left coins on the scarred wooden table. Enough to pay for the drink and the information, not enough to be remembered. The afternoon heat hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside, the sun a merciless white eye in a sky bleached of color. But the heat was familiar, almost comforting. She had been born to this landscape of extremes, had learned to read its moods like other people read faces. The mission bells had long since fallen silent, their bronze voices stolen by raiders years ago, but their absence rang louder than any sound. Clara pulled her horse's reins from the hitching post and swung into the saddle, her movements fluid with long practice. The mare was a good desert horse, small and hardy, with intelligent eyes and the kind of sure-footedness that meant the difference between life and death in the canyons. As she rode south toward the ruins, Clara allowed herself to imagine the moment of confrontation. She had played it out in her mind so many times that it felt like a memory rather than a fantasy. She would find him weak, perhaps dying already from his wounds. She would look into his eyes and see her brother's last moments reflected there. And then justice would finally be done, and the stone in her chest might finally crumble into dust. The mission ruins rose from the desert floor like broken teeth, red adobe walls crumbling back into the earth that had birthed them. Once this place had rung with the voices of priests and the faithful, had been a beacon of hope in the wilderness. Now it was home only to scorpions and memories. Its bell tower collapsed, its sanctuary open to the indifferent sky. She found him by the dried riverbed, 300 yards from the ruins, collapsed against a boulder with blood seeping through his shirt, like dark flowers blooming on cotton. From her hiding place among the mesquite bushes, Clara studied the man who had haunted her dreams for 3 years, the figure who had grown to mythic proportions in her imagination. He was smaller than she had expected, more human. The black hair that had earned him his nickname fell across a face lined with exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness that seemed to go down to his bones. This was not the monster of her nightmares, the figure who stalked through her dreams with eyes like coals and hands dripping blood. This was just a man, bleeding and alone, his breathing shallow and labored as his body fought against injuries that spoke of a recent encounter with either the law or someone else seeking their own brand of justice. His clothes were torn and travel-stained, his boots worn thin at the heels. A gun lay within reach of his right hand, but his fingers weren't moving toward it. Instead, they were pressed against his side, trying to stem the flow of blood that had already stained the ground beneath him dark red. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt, the familiar weight of it grounding her in purpose. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. The confrontation, the justice, the final settling of accounts that would balance the cosmic ledger and allow her to breathe freely again. In her fantasies, he had been defiant, unrepentant, forcing her to become the instrument of justice she had always known she must be. But none of her imaginings had prepared her for the overwhelming stillness that settled over her now, watching him struggle with each breath, seeing the vulnerability that pain had carved into his features. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing, the desert silence like a knife through silk. The sound made him open his eyes, dark as storm clouds, wide with surprise and something that might have been relief. He didn't reach for the gun at his side. He didn't try to scramble away or shout threats or bargain for his life. He simply watched her emerge from the bushes with the weary acceptance of a man who had been running too long, who had perhaps been expecting this moment as long as she had been seeking it. The space between them seemed to thrum with invisible energy, with the weight of all the words that would soon need to be spoken, all the truths that would finally see daylight after years of festering in shadow. Clara found herself caught between impulses, the urge to run forward with the knife to end this quickly and cleanly, and another urge she couldn't quite name, something that made her feet move slowly, carefully, as if she were approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. When she was close enough to see the fever flush on his cheeks, close enough to smell the copper scent of blood and the sweet corruption of infection, she stopped. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. "You're him," she said, and the words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread far beyond the physical space they occupied. He nodded, a small movement that sent a spasm of pain across his features. "I suppose you've come to finish what the others started." His voice was rougher than she had expected, worn thin by thirst and exhaustion, but underneath she could hear something else, an accent that spoke of education, of a background that didn't match the reputation that had preceded him into legend. Clara knelt beside him, her hands hovering over the bloodstain spreading across his chest like a dark flower blooming on white cotton. Up close, she could see the fever flush on his cheeks, the way his eyes struggled to maintain focus, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of blood loss and infection. This close, he looked younger than his reputation suggested, though lines of pain and regret had carved premature age around his eyes and mouth. "You're dying," she said, and the observation was clinical, detached, as if she were examining a piece of broken pottery rather than the man who had destroyed her family. "Been dying for years," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the mesquite. "Just took a while to catch up." Without thinking, without consulting the part of her mind that had planned this moment for 3 years, Clara tore a strip from her skirt. The cotton gave way with a soft ripping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence. She pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound, feeling the warmth of his blood seeping through the fabric, staining her fingers red as autumn leaves, red as the sunset that had painted the sky the night Miguel died. His blood was warm and human, and touching it made something crack inside her chest, some careful wall she had built around her heart to keep it functioning despite the damage. She had expected his blood to feel different somehow, colder, perhaps, or somehow marked by the evil she had attributed to him. Instead, it felt exactly like blood should feel, like the blood she had cleaned from Miguel's clothes before they buried him, like her own blood when she cut her fingers on thorns or kitchen knives. "Why?" he asked, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Why what? Why help me? You know who I am, what I've done." The words came out in short gasps, each one clearly an effort. Clara didn't answer immediately. She couldn't because she didn't know the answer herself. Some deeper instinct had taken over, some part of her that responded to suffering regardless of who was doing the suffering. She applied more pressure to the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, and felt him wince under her touch. "Can you walk?" she asked instead of answering his question. "I can try. There's an old cabin about a mile north of here, abandoned, but it has walls and a roof." He studied her face as if trying to solve a puzzle written in a language he didn't quite speak. "Why would you care if I have walls and a roof?" "I don't know," Clara said, and the honesty of it surprised her. "Maybe I just don't believe in letting things die wounded. Even dangerous things." The question hung between them like smoke, and Clara found herself unable to answer it. Instead, she helped him to his feet, feeling the tremor of pain that ran through his body when he moved, feeling the way he tried not to lean on her too heavily, despite his obvious weakness. Together, they began the slow journey toward whatever sanctuary the desert might offer. The abandoned cabin sat like a forgotten prayer among the pine trees that clung to the higher elevation, its walls weathered silver by wind and time, its roof sagging but intact. Clara half-carried, half-dragged him through the doorway that hung open like a mouth frozen mid-word, her grandmother's voice whispering warnings she chose not to heed. She had meant to watch him die, to see justice done, in the clean simplicity of nature's judgment, the way drought killed weak plants and winter took the unprepared. Instead, she found herself building a fire. The cabin's interior was simple but functional, a stone fireplace, a narrow cot with a straw mattress, a wooden table scarred by the knives of previous occupants, shelves that held a few cracked bowls, and a tin pot blackened by use. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that slanted through gaps in the chinking, and spider webs draped the corners like lace curtains left too long undisturbed. But it was shelter, and after days of sleeping under stars and dodging bounty, Hunter's shelter felt like luxury. He lay unconscious on the narrow cot, his breathing shallow but steady, his face slack with the kind of deep sleep that comes from exhaustion and blood loss. Clara heated water in the battered pot, feeding the fire with deadfall she found around the cabin's perimeter, her movements automatic, learned from years of tending her grandmother's illnesses during the long winters, when fever and cough stalked the borderlands like patient predators. She cleaned his wound with careful precision, noting the old scars that mapped a history of violence across his chest. A knife wound below his left shoulder, a bullet scar near his collarbone, burns on his forearms that looked like rope marks. Each mark told a story, and together they painted a picture of a life lived hard and dangerous, a man who had collected injuries the way other people collected memories. When she touched the silver pendant at her throat, Miguel's face smiled back at her from memory, young and laughing, unaware that his life would end before it truly began, before he could fulfill any of the dreams that had lit up his eyes when he talked about the future. He had wanted to teach children, to open a school in their village where kids could learn to read and write and think for themselves. Education is the only revolution that lasts, he had told her, quoting someone he'd read about in one of the books he treasured, like other men treasured gold. Now Miguel was 3 years dead, and the man who had killed him lay unconscious in a stranger's bed, while she played nursemaid to his wounds. The irony was so sharp, it made her stomach clench with something that might have been nausea, or might have been the beginning of understanding she wasn't ready to face. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a shower of pine needles across the roof like scattered thoughts. Clara pulled a chair close to the fire and settled in to wait. She had been waiting for 3 years already. A few more hours wouldn't matter, but as she watched him sleep, she found herself studying his face in the firelight, noting the way sleep smoothed away the lines of pain and weariness, making him look younger, more vulnerable. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and she resisted, the urge to brush it away. This was her enemy, she reminded herself. This was the man whose death would finally allow her to lay Miguel to rest. But the reminder felt hollow, like words spoken in a language she was forgetting how to understand. Why? His voice cut through the cabin's darkness like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Clara looked up from the fire she'd been feeding, with nervous energy, adding stick after stick to flames that already burned bright enough to chase away the mountain chill. 3 days had passed since she'd brought him here. 3 days of silent ministration and unasked questions. 3 days of watching him fight his way back from the edge of death with a stubbornness that reminded her uncomfortably of Miguel's refusal to give up on anything he believed in. Why what? She asked, though she knew what he meant. The question had been hanging between them like smoke since the moment she'd pressed cloth to his wound instead of a knife to his throat. Why save me? He struggled to sit up, his face pale in the firelight, but determined, his dark eyes catching the flame's reflection like deep water holding stars. You know who I am, what I've done. She stirred the soup she'd been preparing from jerky and wild onions she'd found growing near the cabin, avoiding his gaze because she didn't trust what he might see in her eyes. Her hands were steadier than her heart, but only just. Maybe I don't believe in letting things die wounded, even dangerous things. The question hung between them like smoke, heavy with implications she wasn't ready to explore. Clara ladled soup into a wooden bowl, the liquid steaming in the cool air, carrying the scent of sage and something wilder, something that spoke of survival in hard places. Her grandmother had taught her to cook like this, making meals from whatever the land offered, finding nourishment in unlikely places. "Eat," she said, offering him the bowl. He accepted it, their fingers brushing in the exchange, skin against skin, warm and human, and somehow more intimate than it should have been. His hands were larger than she'd expected, scarred but gentle. The hands of someone who had learned to be careful with fragile things, even if he'd also learned to be dangerous when necessary. "What's your name?" he asked, after he'd taken a few sips of the soup. "Clara." The name felt strange on her tongue, as if she hadn't spoken it aloud in years. She had been so focused on being Miguel's sister, the woman seeking justice, that she'd almost forgotten she had her own identity separate from her grief. He repeated it softly, as if testing its weight, the way a person might handle a piece of precious metal to judge its purity. "Clara?" The name sounded different in his voice, softer somehow, touched with something that might have been wonder or gratitude or recognition of something he couldn't quite name. He began. "I know who you are," she interrupted, because she wasn't ready to hear him claim a name, to become a person rather than a symbol of everything she'd lost. But he continued anyway, his voice quiet but steady. "My given name is David Cruz. The other name, that's just something people call me." She wanted to tell him she didn't care what his real name was, that names couldn't change what he'd done or undo the damage he'd caused. But something in the way he said it, tentative as if offering a gift he wasn't sure would be accepted, made her bite back the harsh words and simply nod instead. They ate in silence after that, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind moving through the pine trees outside, like whispered conversations in a language neither of them spoke. But somehow in that silence something shifted. The man on the cot was no longer just Lobo Negro, the faceless killer of her nightmares. He was David Cruz, and he drank soup carefully because his side hurt, and he said her name like it mattered. She watched him grow stronger each day, watched color return to his cheeks and steadiness to his hands, like spring returning to the high country after a hard winter. He helped where he could, mending the broken shutter with careful attention to the wood's grain, fixing the loose floorboard with strips torn from his own shirt when he couldn't find proper materials, small acts of service that spoke louder than gratitude or obligation. They moved around each other in the cabin's cramped space, like dancers learning a careful choreography, never quite touching, never quite apart, their movements synchronized by necessity and something else she couldn't name. On the 7th morning, she found him sitting on the porch steps staring out at the valley below, where morning mist rose from the arroyos like the ghosts of ancient rivers. The early light cast shadows across his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable, less like the hard man of reputation, and more like someone who might have been Miguel's friend under different circumstances. "Tell me about him," he said without turning, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's breath caught in her throat like a bird trapped in a too small cage. "Who?" "The one you're mourning. I can see it in your eyes, the shape of a loss." He turned to look at her then, and his dark eyes held a gentleness that made her chest tighten with unexpected pain. "The way you touch that locket, the way you sometimes look at me like you're seeing someone else." She sat beside him on the weathered steps, leaving careful space between them on the sun-warmed wood. The distance felt important, a boundary that needed to be maintained, even as other boundaries seemed to be dissolving without her permission. "His name was Miguel, my brother." The words came slowly, like water from a deep well that hadn't been drawn from in too long. He was going to be a teacher, said he wanted to change the world with books and kindness. David, she found herself thinking of him by his real name now, though she wasn't sure when that shift had happened, nodded slowly, his expression grave. "How old?" 19. The number fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond the simple fact of her brother's age at death. "Tell me about him," David said again, and this time it wasn't a question but a gentle invitation, an opening of space for memories that had been locked away like precious things too fragile to touch. So Clara found herself talking about Miguel in a way she hadn't since his funeral, not as a symbol of innocence destroyed or a cause for vengeance, but as a person. She told David about the way Miguel used to read to the children in their village, how he'd saved every penny to buy books, how he'd dreamed of starting a library where anyone could come to learn. She spoke of his laugh, which had been loud and infectious, and his terrible cooking, which had been legendary in their family for all the wrong reasons. She described the way he'd cried when their grandmother died, unashamed of his tears, and how he'd held Clara's hand during the funeral mass like they were children again. As she spoke, she watched David's face, seeing something there that looked like grief but was somehow more complex. His eyes never left her face, and she had the sense that he was memorizing every word, storing them away like precious things to be examined later in private moments. "He sounds like he was a good man," David said when she finally fell silent. He was the best of us." Clara touched the locket at her throat, feeling the familiar weight of it, but somehow it felt different now. Not quite so heavy, perhaps, or just weighted with something other than pure sorrow. "That's why—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but David nodded as if he understood. "That's why you came looking for me." "Yes." They sat in silence then, watching the sun climb higher above the valley, painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound was wild and lonely and somehow beautiful. They worked together in the garden behind the cabin, their hands dark with earth and sweat, their movements falling into the rhythm of shared labor. Clara had found seeds in an old tin can tucked behind the chimney, tomatoes, peppers, herbs that would grow wild if given the chance, left by some previous inhabitant who had believed in the possibility of spring even in the hardest places. She watched David handle the seedlings with surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers careful with the delicate green shoots, his movements speaking of some knowledge about growing things that seemed at odds with his reputation. "You don't seem like a killer," she said, then immediately regretted the words. They hung in the air between them like smoke, impossible to take back. He was quiet for a long moment, patting soil around a young tomato plant with the careful attention of someone who understood the delicate balance between support and freedom that growing things required. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "We're all more than our worst moments." "Are we?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with the frustration of 3 years spent trying to reconcile the monster of her nightmares with the man who helped. Her plant gardens and fixed broken shutters with patient care. "I have to believe that," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. "Otherwise, what's the point of breathing?" A hummingbird darted between them, its wings catching the afternoon light like scattered diamonds, its presence a brief blessing in the growing heat of the day. Clara touched the locket at her throat, feeling the familiar weight of her brother's memory, but somehow it felt different now. Lighter, perhaps, or just less sharp around the edges. The constant ache that had lived beneath her ribs for 3 years was still there, but it had changed shape, become something more complex than simple grief. "What were you before?" she asked. "Before you became what you became?" David's hands stilled in the soil, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him. "I was a teacher." The words hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected and impossible that for a moment she couldn't breathe. "What?" "I taught in a school in Tucson. Mathematics mostly, but literature too when they needed someone." He wasn't looking at her, his attention focused on the seedling in his hands, as if it held secrets he was trying to decipher. "I had 32 students the year everything changed. I knew all their names, their dreams, which ones struggled with reading and which ones could solve problems that stumped adults." Clara felt something crack inside her chest, some careful wall she'd built around her heart to keep it functioning. Despite the damage, "How did you become a killer?" The word fell between them like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. The same way anyone becomes something they never meant to be. One choice at a time, each one making the next one easier until you look up one day and don't recognize the person staring back at you from the mirror. He finally looked at her then, and she saw in his eyes the same kind of loss she'd been carrying for 3 years, but older, deeper, worn smooth by time and regret. I had a sister too, younger than me. She got mixed up with the wrong people, owed money to the kind of men who collect debts in blood. I tried to help her, tried to find a legal way to solve the problem. But legal ways take time, and she didn't have time. Clara waited, sensing there was more to the story, afraid to ask but unable to stop listening. So I made a choice, David continued. I used my knowledge of people, of how they think and what they fear, to solve her problem in a way that wasn't legal. And it worked. She was safe. But word got around that the quiet teacher had teeth when he needed them. People started coming to me with problems they couldn't solve through proper channels. And I kept saying yes because the money was good, and my sister needed care, and it seemed like I was helping people who had nowhere else to turn. What happened to her? Clara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Cholera took her 2 years later. All that money, all those choices, all that blood on my hands, and I couldn't save her from getting sick. His laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. Turns out violence doesn't solve as many problems as people think it does. They worked in silence after that, their hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of planting and watering, each lost in their own thoughts. But somehow in that shared silence, Clara felt something shift. The man beside her was no longer just Miguel's killer, or even just David Cruz, the former teacher. He was someone who understood the weight of loss, the way grief could change the shape of a person's choices until they didn't recognize themselves anymore. It was supposed to be simple, he said. They sat by the fire after dinner, the cabin filled with the comfortable silence that had grown between them over 2 weeks of shared meals and careful conversations. Clara looked up from the letter she'd been writing, words to no one, thoughts that needed somewhere to go because keeping them inside was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The paper was rough, made from whatever materials the cabin's previous inhabitant had found, but it served its purpose. The job, you mean? She set down her pen, a simple piece of sharpened wood with a metal tip that scratched against the paper, like a whisper. He nodded, staring into the flames as if they held answers to questions he'd been carrying for too long. A cattle baron's son had been cheating local ranchers, taking their land through legal tricks, using laws most of them couldn't read to steal everything they'd worked for. Families were losing their homes, their livelihoods. Children were going hungry because their father's cattle had been claimed by men who'd never worked a day in their lives. Clara waited, sensing the weight of what was coming, the way the air thickens before a storm. We were hired to discourage him, make him understand that there were consequences for his actions. That couldn't be bought off with lawyers and legal papers. David's voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. It was supposed to be a conversation. Intimidation maybe, but not violence, not unless he forced our hand. But the word was barely a whisper. He wasn't alone that night. Had his younger brother with him, a kid who'd gotten caught up in something he didn't understand. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and Clara had to lean forward to hear him. The boy tried to protect him, drew a gun he barely knew how to hold. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars seeking their home in the night sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate, the sound lonely and beautiful, and somehow appropriate for the moment that hung between them like a bridge over deep water. I never meant for it to happen, David continued, and his voice carried the weight of 3 years of sleepless nights. It was dark, confusing. There were shouts, movement, the sound of horses spooked by gunfire. I thought he was reaching for a different weapon, thought I saw metal that wasn't there. By the time I realized what I'd done, by the time I understood that he was just a kid trying to protect someone he loved, Clara felt something shift inside her chest, like ice breaking on a river in spring, like foundations settling in ways that would change the architecture of everything built on top of them. She thought of Miguel in that moment, thought of how he would have reacted if someone had threatened her, how he would have done anything to keep her safe, even if he didn't know how to fight, even if the odds were impossible. He was trying to save his brother, she said, and the words felt like a revelation. Yes. David's voice broke on the word. He was 19 years old, and he died trying to save someone he loved, and I was the one who killed him for it. The silence that followed felt different from the comfortable quiet they'd shared before. This was heavier, charged with the weight of truth finally spoken, of secrets that had been carried too long in darkness. Clara stared into the fire, watching. The flames dance and shift, thinking about choices and consequences and the terrible randomness of violence. "What was his name?" she asked finally. "Miguel." The name fell between them like a prayer, like an apology, like a wound finally exposed to air and light. His name was Miguel Santos. She found the letter in his coat pocket while mending a tear in the fabric, her fingers discovering the folded paper by accident while searching for her needle. Her name was written across the front in careful script, the letters formed with the precision of someone who had once taught children how to shape words with their hands. Beneath her name, in the same careful handwriting, were words that made her hands tremble. "Clara, I know you came here to kill me. I know I deserve it. Your brother died because of my carelessness, my fear, my inability to see clearly in the dark. I have carried his death like a sickness for 3 years, and I will carry it until I die. There are no words adequate to express my regret, no actions that can undo what I have done. If my death would bring you peace, I offer it freely. You have only to ask, and I will not resist. But if there is any chance that healing might come, another way, I am willing to learn how to be more than the worst thing I have ever done. I see your brother in the way you tend the garden, in your careful hands and kind eyes, in the gentle way you speak of growing things. He would have been proud of the woman you are, proud of your strength and your mercy. I know this because I was a teacher once and I knew boys like him, good boys who believed in making the world better through small acts of kindness. I cannot give you back your brother. I cannot undo the choice that took him from you. But I can promise you this. If you choose mercy over justice, if you find it in your heart to let me live, I will spend every day of my remaining life earning that gift. I will plant gardens in his memory. I will teach children to read if any will have me. I will try to become the man he might have forgiven if he had lived long enough to know the whole story. I understand if you cannot make that choice. I understand if the weight of your grief is too great to allow for forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that these weeks with you have been the first time in 3 years that I have felt human again. You have shown me kindness I did not deserve, and in doing so you have reminded me of who I used to be before I became a killer. Whatever you decide, know that you have already given me more than I had any right to ask for. David. Clara sank onto the cot, the letter clutched against her chest, her breathing shallow and quick as if she'd been running. Outside, thunder rumbled across the valley, promising rain, and the sound matched the storm building in her own chest. She read the letter again, then a third time, each reading revealing new layers of meaning, new complexities she hadn't noticed before. This was not the letter of a cold-blooded killer. This was the words of a man drowning in regret, someone who understood exactly what he had taken from the world when he pulled that trigger in the dark. The careful script spoke of hours spent crafting each sentence, of thoughts turned over and examined from every angle, of a conscience that had never stopped working even when its owner wished it would. She thought of Miguel, of his face on the day he decided to become a teacher, the way his eyes had lit up when he talked about all the children he would help learn to read. Miguel had always believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption even for people who had made terrible mistakes. Everyone deserves the chance to become better than they were, he had told her once, when she'd been angry at a neighbor who had cheated their family in a business deal. That's what makes us human, the ability to change, to grow, to choose, differently tomorrow than we chose today. But Miguel was dead, and the man who had killed him was asking her to be more forgiving than she knew how to be. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like the approaching storm, heavy and inescapable. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the cabin's roof like tears. The rain came in sheets, turning the earth to mud, and filling the air with the scent of sage and possibility. with the green smell of growing things awakening after long drought. Clara stood in the doorway, watching David work to secure the shutters against the wind that howled down from the mountains, like all the voices of the dead crying out for justice or mercy. She couldn't tell which. Water plastered his dark hair to his skull, made his shirt cling to the lean lines of his body, highlighting the careful way he moved to protect his healing wound. There was something beautiful about him in that moment, something that reminded her of Miguel's grace when he worked with his hands, the unconscious poetry of someone who understood the value of small acts of care. When he came inside, dripping and breathless, she handed him a towel without a word, their fingers brushing in the exchange. His skin was cold from the rain, but somehow still warm underneath, and the brief contact sent something like electricity up her arm. Clara. Her name on his lips was a question, a prayer, a word weighted with everything that had passed between them and everything that might yet come to pass. She turned away, busying herself with unnecessary tasks, stirring the fire, rearranging the few dishes on the shelf, anything to avoid the intensity of his gaze. The roof's leaking near the back window. Clara. His hand touched her shoulder, gentle as butterfly wings, and she turned to face him despite every instinct that told her to keep her distance. His eyes held depth she was only beginning to understand, regret and hope warring in their dark waters, the reflection of someone who had learned to carry guilt like other people carried prayer beads, constant and familiar and heavy. "I read your letter," she said, the words barely audible above the sound of rain on the roof. He stepped back, releasing her, his hand falling to his side like a bird shot from the sky. "Then you know. I know you're not the monster I thought you were." The admission felt like tearing away skin, like exposing something that had been carefully protected for too long. "I know my brother died trying to save someone he loved, and I know you've been carrying that weight just as long as I have." Lightning illuminated the cabin in stark white, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Clara saw herself clearly, no longer the girl driven by rage and thirst for vengeance, but a woman standing at the crossroads between what was and what could be, between the past that couldn't be changed and the future that was still unwritten. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice careful, neutral, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter something fragile that was trying to form between them. Clara didn't answer immediately. She couldn't, because she didn't know herself. The certainty that had carried her through 3 years of searching was gone, replaced by something more complex and harder to navigate. She had come here to end a story, to write the final chapter of her brother's death with David's blood, but standing here in the storm-lit cabin, she found herself wondering if there might be other ways to honor Miguel's memory, other kinds of justice that didn't require more death. "I don't know," she said finally, and the honesty of it felt like a gift she was giving both of them. "I don't know what happens now." Thunder rolled across the valley like the voice of God, and in its echo Clara heard something that might have been forgiveness, or might have been the promise of rain after long drought. So either way, it sounded like hope. She woke before dawn, slipping from the cabin while David still slept, his breathing deep and steady in the rhythm of healing. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming, every surface, reflecting the pale light of pre-dawn like scattered mirrors. Clara walked to the cliff's edge where she had stood a month ago, her grandmother's locket heavy against her throat, its familiar weight both comfort and burden. The valley spread below her, green and alive with morning light, transformed by the night's rain into something that looked like Eden, might have looked before the fall. Somewhere down there was the life she had left behind. The townspeople who expected her to return with news of justice served, the friends who had fed her anger and urged her toward revenge, the grave where Miguel lay waiting for her to keep, the promise she had whispered over his coffin. She thought of Miguel, not as he had died but as he had lived, laughing, dreaming, believing in the possibility of redemption, even for lost souls. What would he say if he could see her now? If he could know about the man sleeping in the cabin behind her, the man who had killed him by accident and had been dying of guilt ever since. Miguel had always been wiser than his years, had possessed an understanding of human nature that came from some deep well of compassion she had never fully comprehended. "What would you want me to do?" she whispered to the wind, to the morning. Light, to whatever remained of her brother in the space between earth and sky. The answer came not in words but in memory. Miguel at 13, insisting on helping their drunken neighbor home instead of leaving him to sleep it off in the street. Miguel at 16, tutoring the village children who couldn't afford to pay for lessons. Miguel at 18, defending a dog that had been caught stealing food, arguing that hunger was not a crime worthy of death. He had always chosen mercy when mercy was possible, had always believed that understanding was more powerful than judgment. When she returned to the cabin, she found David sitting at the table, his few possessions packed in a worn leather satchel that spoke of many journeys, many departures. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he were trying not to disturb the peace of the morning with the weight of his decision. "You're leaving," she said, and it wasn't a question. He looked up, his eyes carefully neutral, the expression of someone who had learned to expect disappointment and prepare for it accordingly. "I won't make you choose between mercy and justice. I won't put that burden on you." Clara sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of the moment settling around them like morning mist. "And if I asked you to stay?" Something flickered in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or fear, or the kind of desperate longing that comes from being alone too long. "Why would you?" "Because I think we're both tired of carrying our ghosts alone." The words came from somewhere deeper than thought, from a place that understood healing in ways her mind was still struggling to accept. Because Miguel would have wanted me to choose mercy over vengeance. Because 3 years of hatred have made me into someone I don't recognize, and I want to remember how to be the person my brother believed I could become. David's hands stilled on the leather strap of his satchel. "And if the townspeople come looking? If they find us here?" "Then we'll face that when it happens. But I won't let fear of what might come steal what peace we might find now." Clara reached across the table, her fingers covering his, skin against skin, warm and human and somehow healing. "Stay, David. Help me plant the rest of the garden. Help me learn how to live with grief instead of being consumed by it." He turned his hand palm up, their fingers interlacing like roots, finding each other in dark earth. "Are you sure?" "No," she admitted, "but I'm sure that running away from each other won't honor Miguel's memory any better than killing you would have. And I'm sure that forgiveness is harder than revenge, but maybe that's what makes it worth choosing." Outside, a meadowlark called to the rising sun, its song bright and clear and full of the promise that comes with new mornings, with choices that change the shape of everything that follows. They planted the rest of the garden together as summer deepened, their movements, synchronized by weeks of shared labor and growing trust, their hands working the earth that had been softened by rain and time. Clara watched David coax life from the reluctant soil and realized that redemption, like growth, was a slow and careful process, something that happened not in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to tend what needed tending, to water what needed watering, to believe in the possibility of harvest even when the seeds were too small to see. He had chosen a new name, David, his given name, leaving the other behind like an old coat that no longer fit. Lobo Negro was never really me, he explained one afternoon as they worked side by side in the growing heat. He was just a story people told about a man who lost his way. But stories can be changed, can't they? We can write new endings if we're brave enough to keep turning the pages. Clara liked the way his real name sounded in her mouth, liked the way he smiled when she said it, as if she were giving him a gift each time she spoke it aloud. David. It suited him better than the legend ever had. Fit the man who sang softly while he worked, and knew the names of all the plants they grew, and who read to her in the evenings from books left behind by the cabin's previous inhabitants. The townspeople came eventually, following rumors and whispers, drawn by stories of a woman who had gone into the mountains seeking vengeance and never returned. Clara met them at the valley's edge, her chin raised and her voice steady, wearing the authority of someone who had looked death in the face and chosen life instead. "He's dead," she told them. And it wasn't entirely a lie. The man they sought, Lobo Negro, the black wolf, had died beside a dried riverbed, killed not by bullets or blades, but by the simple act of being seen as human, by the recognition that monsters were only men who had forgotten how to be anything else. They accepted her word and left her in peace, carrying with them the story of justice served and debts paid in full. But Clara knew the truth was more complex than any story could contain, knew that the real justice lay not in death, but in the choice to live differently, to plant gardens instead of graves, to choose healing over hatred even when hatred felt easier. As the days grew longer and the plants grew taller, Clara found herself changing too. The constant ache that had lived beneath her ribs for 3 years was still there, but it had transformed into something else. Not the sharp pain of fresh grief, but the deeper, more complex emotion that comes from learning to carry loss without being crushed by it. She still missed Miguel, would always miss him, but now she could remember his laughter without feeling like it was being torn from her chest. "Do you think he would approve?" David asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Of this, of us, of what we're building here. Clara considered the question seriously, thinking of her brother's face, his dreams, his unshakable belief in the possibility of redemption. "I think he would understand that forgiveness is not about forgetting or excusing what happened. I think he would see that we're both trying to become better than we were, and that's all any of us can do." The garden flourished under their care, growing wild and abundant, heavy with tomatoes and peppers and herbs that would carry them through the coming winter. But more than that, something else was growing between them. Not love, not yet, but something deeper and more durable. Trust, perhaps. Understanding. The kind of connection that comes from seeing each other's worst moments and choosing to stay anyway. Autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, and Clara stood in their garden. She thought of it as theirs now, without reservation, harvesting the last of the tomatoes before the first frost could claim them. The plants had grown, wild and abundant, heavy with fruit that tasted of sunshine and rain and the careful tending of patient hands. Each tomato a small miracle of transformation from seed to sustenance. David worked beside her, his movements easy and unhurried. No longer the careful motions of a man nursing wounds, but the fluid grace of someone who had found peace in simple work. The scars on his chest had faded to silver lines, and the haunted look had left his eyes, replaced by something she chose to call contentment, or perhaps hope, or maybe just the quiet satisfaction that comes from learning to live with oneself again. "Do you ever wonder," she said, setting a ripe tomato in the basket, with the reverence due to something that had required faith to bring into being, "what Miguel would think of all this?" David paused in his work, considering the question with the seriousness he brought to all discussions of her brother. He had developed a habit of speaking about Miguel as if he had known him personally, as if the stories Clara had shared had somehow made the young man real to him in ways that went beyond guilt or regret. "I think he'd be proud of you," he said finally, "of the choice you made. It would have been easier to choose revenge, easier to let hatred make your decisions for you, but you chose the harder path, the one that required you to see me as human instead of monster. That takes a kind of courage most people never have to find in themselves." Clara touched the locket at her throat, feeling its familiar weight, then, with careful deliberation, lifted it over her head. She had carried her brother's memory like a weight for so long that its absence felt strange, like learning to breathe, underwater, like discovering that the thing she thought was holding her together had actually been holding her back. She placed the locket in David's palm, closing his fingers around it with gentle pressure. The metal was warm from her skin, and she could see the surprise in his eyes, the question he was afraid to ask. "Keep him with you," she said, "not as a burden, but as a reminder." Of what? That every ending can become a beginning, that people can change, can grow, can choose differently tomorrow than they chose yesterday. That's what Miguel believed, and that's what I want to believe too. David opened his hand, looking down at the locket as if it were made of something more, precious than silver. "I don't know if I deserve this." "None of us deserve grace," Clara said, the words carrying the weight of all the forgiveness she had learned to give and accept over the long months in the mountains. That's what makes it grace. It's not about deserving, it's about choosing. To believe that transformation is possible, that people are more than their worst moments. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of forgiveness, rose and gold and deep purple, colors that spoke of endings that were also beginnings of light that persisted even in darkness. In the distance, a wolf howled, not in anger or hunger, but in recognition of its place in the vast interconnected web of life, a sound that was wild and lonely and somehow beautiful. Clara took David's hand, their fingers interlacing like roots finding each other in the dark earth, like two people who had learned to trust in growth despite the hardness of the ground. Together they walked toward the cabin where a fire waited to welcome them home, where books waited to be read aloud, where tomorrow's seeds waited to be planted when spring came again. The garden would sleep through winter, its work done, its fruit harvested and stored against the cold months ahead. But come spring it would bloom again, wild and abundant and full of impossible grace, proof that even in the hardest places, even after the darkest seasons, life found a way to begin again. As they reached the cabin door, Clara looked back, once at the garden, at the plants that had taught them both about patience and tending, and the long work of healing. Miguel's memory lived there now, not as grief or guilt, but as growing things, as the promise that love could survive death and transform into something new, something that fed rather than consumed, something that honored the dead by choosing to live fully, beautifully, without reservation. The locket caught the last light of day as David lifted it to his throat, and for a moment, Clara could swear she saw Miguel's face smiling back at her from the silver surface, not the young man who had died too soon, but the teacher he had always been, the one who believed in second chances and new beginnings, and the infinite possibility of grace.